And we're live. Welcome back, everyone. Owen here. It's been a little while. I can't remember if I came on last week or if it's been a week or a couple weeks, but I'm back at it. Hopefully, Midnight will be able to join us again soon. His life is just a little bit hectic right now, and I, if you've been following me on Twitter at all, you'll have noticed some recent posts that relate to today's topic. And the question today is: should people, and let's be honest here, should men with masturbation or porn habits postpone or perhaps even avoid marriage altogether? That's the question. Our friend Annulment Proof asked, why do people even care about this question? And I'm going to get to that in a second. So I'm glad you asked that. Um, and so I've had a couple of polls, and you still have time if you want to vote on this over on Twitter under the Craig Onan Twitter channel. I have 4 polls going on right now, and I'll just read them for you because I don't really have the ability to nicely display them on screen. And just for context and just kind of be upfront right away, this is in reaction to something that Christopher West said on his podcast this week. Don't have a number or whatever, but if you search like Christopher West's podcast, it should be the most recent episode that came out, like I don't know, like the week of September 20th or something, 21st of 2025. Joan and I actually did the episode for this week, which we recorded yesterday. It'll come out this coming Sunday. We actually go into this kind of in depth, but I really want to get a chance to get other people's feedback on this. And if you haven't listened to Christopher West, well, hopefully everyone knows who Christopher West is. If not, Christopher West is, I would say, the face of the theology of the body movement, if there is such a thing. He has sort of taken on the face of the movement that John Paul II started when he was a cardinal, maybe earlier, maybe as a bishop, but certainly as a cardinal, Karol Wojtyla, when he began writing the theology of the body, and then went into his encyclicals like Love and Responsibility, and there may be other ones. That certainly set the stage for Christopher West, who began becoming prominent on the subject of theology of the body and Humani Vitae and all that in probably the mid 1990s, maybe late 1990s, something like that. Um, and he continued, so he has the Theology of the Body Institute, and this is full time career or postulate, mission, whatever you want to call it, basically talking about theology of the body and Humani Vitae and the church's teaching, or at least what he thinks the church's teaching is on these matters. And he is sort of the authority for. I mean, I don't think that's really disputable from the standpoint of the modern. The modern what do I say approach to, let's see, marriage and sexuality in a post Humani Vitae environment. It's hard to think of someone who has a more prominent position than Christopher West. And so one of the things he has a weekly podcast, and the format of it is he usually has 2 to 3 questions of listeners. I've actually written into that before. I have an episode on that over on UCM, on his response to a question that I raised. So anyway, this episode included a question from an anonymous listener. It was a single guy, or I'd say it was an unmarried guy who was had been dating a while and was at the step where he wanted to propose to his girlfriend, and they were looking forward to getting married in the church. And in fact, I think had been going through some I forget the name of it, some pre-marriage, or maybe it's not even pre-marriage, but some course that Christopher West or his institute put out And the issue that came up, the listeners basically said, I, I'm guessing this guy must have been in his late 20s, maybe 30, early 30s. And the facts, as I recall, is he said he had a masturbation addiction. He didn't say what that meant or how frequently by addiction that meant. I think that probably means different things to different people. But the man himself at least characterized it as an addiction that he said he had for 15 years and that he had been actively trying to stop it for the last 5. Okay. So let's assuming he started, let's say maybe in the age, range of 12 to 15, that I guess that makes him 27 to 30. And he had been actively trying to stop for the last 5 years. And I think he also mentioned that he previously had a sort of corresponding porn addiction, which he had been able to root out from his life. Not sure how long he had been quote unquote clean from that. But the question was focused on the topic of his ongoing battles with masturbation, which apparently he had communicated to his girlfriend. She was aware of it, and so the question essentially that he posed to Christopher West was, despite his efforts, I guess the last 5 years, he was still dealing with it. Now, whether he had made strides or reduced the frequency or the amount of attachment he had to it isn't clear. But my assumption is he had gotten better, but hadn't eradicated it for sure. And he was wondering if it was the right thing to do or a fair thing to do to even consider getting married or proposing to his girlfriend until he had quote unquote ended that entirely. And so Christopher West, I mean, I'm not super critical of his I guess assessment. You'll have to go listen to it yourself. But the one comment that caught my attention was, Christopher West was clear. This is just his personal opinion. This is not, any kind of authoritative rule or standard. But he basically said, in his opinion, it would be best if he waited until he was quote unquote 6 months sober or clean from masturbation. I assume entirely, not just, let's say, from the point of when it was addictive in this man's um estimation, which I think there's room for discussion about whether, setting aside the moral issues, but what really constitutes an addiction and what constitutes, let's say, a habit or even an occasional thing, even if it's not a habit, but something that happens from time to time. But I took Christopher West's words to be like, if you've done it in the last 6 months, you should not propose to your girlfriend. And and if you listen to this week's episode of UCM, Jonah and I kind of go into that, what our thoughts are on it. I think you can probably guess what our thoughts are, but I'm curious what other people's thoughts are on that. I would think, and that's one of the reasons for the polls, because I've got some polls over on Twitter. Like I said, you still have some time to answer them. But I put two questions out, and so I asked people. First of all, I said, "Have you ever had an addiction?" And I have addiction in quotes because it's not necessarily clear. Maybe not everyone agrees on what that means, but have you ever had an addiction? Not that you currently do. But have you ever had an addiction to masturbation? And by addiction, I said I simply mean unable to stop if you want to. And I break these polls down into 4 questions. I'm a man, yes. I'm a man, no. I'm a woman, yes. I'm a woman, no. And you can answer yes or no depending on your gender. And we don't have a ton of, and we have 18 votes on that question. And I won't get into the specifics of it because it's an open poll, but not real surprising. The overwhelming majority of men answered yes to that. A few said no, and the not quite as much overwhelming majority, but a majority of women said no, and a few said yes. Okay, and that is pretty much what I expected. I think there are certainly, I think for the vast majority of situations, this is primarily a male problem, especially if you're talking about addiction. Maybe not whether someone ever does it, but just from a, do they feel addicted to it? And then I asked the same question, and I said, "Have you ever had an addiction to porn?" And by addiction, I simply mean unable to stop if you want to. And so same setup. Men can answer yes or no. Women can answer yes or no. The results are much more evenly split between yeses and nos on men. And so far, all of the women have said no, and there's no woman that said yes. And again, that I would say kind of corresponds to what I sort of expected. And then just sort of in anticipation of this episode, I just posted a new poll asking the question, essentially the two questions at hand in this episode, which is first question: should people with a masturbation habit, I said habit, not addiction, that probably means something different, but a habit they can't stop or if should people with a masturbation habit they can't stop postpone or avoid marriage? Men can answer yes or no, women can answer yes or no. And then I add the same question: should people with a porn habit that they can't stop postpone or avoid marriage? And um, sort of as expected, the preliminary results, which again are there's not a lot of votes, the those that responded were much more in favor of someone with simply a masturbation habit going forward with marriage, but the majority believe that someone with a porn habit should postpone or avoid marriage. And so that's sort of the question that I wanted to talk about a little bit, get people's feedback. If you chime in, I'll offer my thoughts a little bit. Um, One of the things that I have, I mean, depending on the source of the poll and kind of how the questions are asked, I don't think there's any real question, even within Catholic circles, and even I would say within the traditionalist circles. Father Ripperger caught some heat. I think kind of got into some controversy in the last few months when he made the comment. I think essentially that these problems are just as prevalent, if not more prevalent, from the standpoint of what he hears in confession amongst the traditionalist movement as compared to the quote unquote, let's say, mainstream or conventional Catholics. Um, that surprised me a little bit. Didn't shock me, but that surprised me. And I would say that the primary backlash that he got, that I understand, I think there's some legitimacy to it, was that, well, it's not really fair to compare the traditionalists with the, let's say, everyday Catholics, because the traditionalists are much more likely to bring something like this up into confession, and let's say the more casual Catholics may not even consider it a sin, may not bring it to confession, and so maybe that skews the results. I don't know if that's true or not. Maybe more so on the question of masturbation and less so on the porn issue. I mean, I think most people, most Catholics, um, would view it as wrong, and it would be something that if they're going to confession would probably bring it to confession if that's what they do. But I don't know. I can't. I don't. That's just my impression and speculation. But regardless, it's clearly these issues, and they, no pun intended, they often go hand in hand. Um, and I think there's different things that are worth consideration about that. But let's just for the moment just kind of treat these issues separately. My personal feeling, and I think most people would agree with this, that um, maybe this isn't the technically correct answer, but I think on a sort of on a somewhat morally pragmatic level, I think most of us understand that porn represents a greater sin, a greater problem, greater um, harm to oneself and to others, and perhaps your relationships than masturbation, especially if masturbation is sort of occurring in isolation of that. I hope we can agree on that, and I don't think there's anything morally problematic about that. I mean, I just think now related to that is people sometimes wonder is um is porn essentially the equivalent of actually having a physical affair? And I would disagree with that. Um, not not in any way condoning porn use, but I definitely think that you know, I think I think if you cross the line and you actually become physically intimate with someone, whether it's well, let's say it's cheating in the sense that it's adultery, or let's say even if you're not married and you're cheating on your fiance or whatever, I consider that adultery. I think that's different, I guess, from a practical level than let's say pure fornication, which is just two people that are, let's say maybe they're engaged, maybe they're not, but they're committed to each other. Um, I'm just talking about where someone has an intimate relationship with someone outside the context of their marriage or existing relationship. And I think most people, I would hope, would agree that that is sort of the worst offense you can make, certainly against God, and if not against God, certainly against your spouse or your fiance or your boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever. Um, and I think it takes a lot more volition, and there's a lot more. I just think personally, there's a lot more culpability there if you do that. And I would think most people, I would like to think most people have um the good sense, the discipline, if you will, to say no to those opportunities if presented. And so I think sort of the top of the pyramid, if you will, in terms of severity is, let's say, actual adultery, actual cheating on your spouse or significant other. And then let's say the next step from that, I would say, is something more in the category of porn. And maybe there's different variations of it. What kind is it? Um, but to me, porn is a step down from adultery, and let's say a step up from, let's just say, pure solo. And um I think based on the data, it's certainly common for people, especially men, at some point in their lives, maybe all their lives, to have some sort of a ongoing either use of porn or temptation to it if they've done it in the past, and it's sort of it is probably something very easy for a lot of people, especially men, to fall into if you've done it before, even if it's been a while, and maybe you relapse, and then you know pick yourself up, go to confession, and then you go for a period of time without it, and then maybe it happens again. I don't know. Every person's a little different. Um, one of the problems I think I have seen play out in the church, especially in, let's say, this TOB environment, is to essentially treat porn use, any porn use, let's say, regardless of the circumstances, frequency, and all that, and the reason why someone's doing it, but to treat that as the same thing as actual physical adultery. And I think that's a problem. I think that's a problem on a just so many levels. But I see that happening, and I see I see marriages or relationships breaking up or in great peril because people have been led to believe that that is essentially the same thing. And I think that is a problem. It doesn't mean it's not a problem. It doesn't mean it's not a violation of the relationship, but I think it's far more a product of, let's say, weakness and circumstance than it is actual adultery, right? Um, have your phone in a moment of weakness, and suddenly you're doing that, right? And not to say again, not to say it's right, but I think the steps that it takes for someone who is, a good person committed against it to suddenly be doing that is much easier uh, when it comes to porn than it does to coming to having um having an actual physical affair. Um, Watching a lot of aquarium porn lately. I don't know what that is, and I don't want to know what it is, but I'm assuming it just means seals and dolphins and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I think as long as you respect their humanity, their non-humanity, their nature and their goodness in God, I think you're okay. But I don't know. Better to ask Christopher West that. So, um, so yeah, I think one ought to distinguish porn use from adultery, and I think I think if they happen, depending on how often they happen, I think they represent different situations from the standpoint of um, whether porn use, let's say, is evidence of a um, failing marriage. I think adultery, actual physical intimacy outside your marriage, is pretty strong evidence that there's something wrong with that marriage, or at least one of the spouses. I don't think that's necessarily the case with respect to porn. I think people can find themselves doing that for a lot of reasons. It can be loneliness. Maybe maybe they're separated for a while because of work or military service or postpartum or whatever. Again, not justifying it, but you know, someone that finds themselves falling into porn because it's been 2 months since they were able to be intimate with their spouse. That's a that's a very different situation than someone that takes steps to secretly have a an affair with your coworker or someone like that. So so I think we have to be able to treat porn differently, but I do think porn is potentially more of a problem, both morally and relationally, than masturbation. Now, again, like I said above, they tend to go hand in hand, but I think that in some ways is a product of the Catholic approach, which is say, well, those are both mortal sins. They're both terrible. I mean, go to confession, you go to hell if you do either one of those. I think it can set people up, especially men who are, let's say, much more likely to struggle with masturbation than porn, to be like, well, I've already done the masturbation. What's stopping me from doing the porn? I think that is something that could easily happen. Um, but that's kind of my feeling. But I think it is, in terms of, we just the degree of likelihood and the degree of culpability. I think the least likely thing to happen, but the thing with the greatest culpability would be adultery, and the thing with the less culpability, but more likely to happen than adultery, but less likely than masturbation, is the porn. And then I think flip it up. I think the most likely to happen, but the least amount of culpability for most people would be the masturbation, right? And I think it's really important for us to be able to make distinctions between those three things, at least on a somewhat morally practical level, because otherwise I think we end up with the kinds of problems that I see in TOB circles that, you know, guys like Christopher West or whatever trying to fix, because I think they're kind of part of the cause of that. Um, Yeah, so I think Tyler's right here, and I think that's kind of the point I was going to get to. Is it would depend on how often, and if it's interfering with other aspects of your life, it would be good to postpone. A relapse while you're actively working on the sin, I think, is different. Would you say the same thing? Would that be your answer, whether it's porn or masturbation? Like, doesn't matter which one it is, or is that your answer, irrespective of which one it is? So if you can clarify that for me, I'd appreciate knowing that, because I think if someone, I mean, I think porn, especially in most situations, is probably done in secret. It's probably not above board. I think has a problem to create some real problems in that relationship, whether it's discovered or not, but especially if it's discovered, right? Um, and I think if we're being honest about the numbers, I think it's far more likely that a man comes into marriage with a secret porn problem and his wife probably doesn't and maybe has never had any experience with it. Um, but I think a man that comes into marriage with, even if you've been 6 months sober, let's call it that. I don't know that I don't know that any man is truly immune from this, right? I think I think the best of men under the most difficult of circumstances is always at risk of falling into this. Um, and so, but I think it has the potential, depending on how the spouses communicate and how the spouses understand each other in marriage. I think I think it can have varying degrees of impact on that marriage, from something as on the one side of the spectrum as being, let's say, the other spouse is maybe hurt or disappointed, but not, you know, they kind of take it as it is, and then they work through it, to the opposite side of the spectrum, where one spouse may be like, well, my marriage is over, I don't even know who this person is anymore. um and then, let's say, everything in between. So I think those are, I think if someone is dealing with porn, and like I said, I mean, I would be surprised. I would say that the vast majority of men, good Catholic men, at some point in time, by the time they get to their marriage years, let's say early 20s, has probably been exposed to porn in some capacity or another. I mean, I would I would think that's so common. I mean, it's especially now. I mean, I went through that phase over 20 years ago, and it really didn't have, we didn't have phones and computer. Um, then, we we had to find our uncle's, dirty magazines or whatever, right? Now, I mean, even with the best, let's see, parental blockers and stuff like that, I think you are going to. I think it's safe to assume that most people, especially most young men, are going to be exposed to it in some respects before they get to marriage. And then it's just a question of how long have you gone since you used it, not whether you'll ever use it. And I would say there's a decent chance that for most guys they're going to be exposed again, whether it's sort of truly volitional, or they're out with the guys, or something comes up, whatever. uh, you know and then it's a question of how do you respond to that. Do you fall off the wagon, and are you suddenly, addicted to it, or is it a kind of a one-off situation that you can, um, you know, dust yourself off, go to confession, maybe you tell your spouse, maybe you don't, and then you move on. I mean, I think a lot of guys are going to probably fall into that category. But, with masturbation, I mean, I would be real surprised if there's many, let's say, guys at least, that get to marriage that have never done that before. And if there are guys that have never done that before they got married, whether it was teenagers or young adults or whatever, I would be curious. But I think most guys have probably done that before, and if you have, it probably wasn't a one-off thing. It was probably multiple times, maybe many times, and then it's just a question of how frequently is it, and whether it rises to the level of addiction or not. So I think, similar to porn, but even more so. Uh, Again, I think you go to marriage. You go into marriage. You are a at best a recovering, you know, porn user or masturbation user. You're and I would say, even more so than porn, the likelihood of it happening again is very high. And I wouldn't even go so far as even in marriage, but I would say it especially in marriage, right? That is just my own. I had some of my own thoughts on that. Um, Thank you, Tyler, for clarifying that. So, in So let's put Tyler's comments. He said it would, depend on how often it's happening. If it's interfering with other aspects of your life, it might be a good idea to postpone marriage. Now, what if you're engaged, and do you call off the wedding if you have a relapse? You could get kind of silly about it, but um, but so he says, I would say for both, but I definitely agree that porn is more harmful than masturbation. I think it's different if it's a secret that you're indulging in than a struggle you're open with. Um, yeah, I would be curious. I would be curious how many people, let's say guys or women, um, talk to your future spouse about your past experience or maybe ongoing experience with these things before you got married. Um, I would I would venture to say most people don't talk about it. We did not talk about it, and and it's been a while since I talked about this on the other podcast, but I basically shared a story when my wife and I got married. Um, Really within weeks of our wedding, I kind of reached out to her and I said, I just want to share something with you, and I wanted to share with her part of my past, and that I didn't want any secrets from her, right? And because at that point I was clean for a while, and it was a very, very traumatic experience. She did not take that well, and it was something that we did not talk about for a long, long time, over 20 years, right? And so I think one of the in part of that, I think there's a variety of factors there. I think number one, it's just not something she ever struggled with and continues to never struggle with. I think especially as a female, she's much more likely to be immune from that. And so it's not, for her, it's a non-issue. And so, the fact that it was an issue for me was something that she um just caught off guard, just had no idea how to relate to that. And then I think second of all, I think, we were both kind of students of theology of the body and all that. She sort of viewed that as, a great affront to our relationship, even though it was something that had happened before we got married. It wasn't something that happened in our marriage, at least at that point in time. Um, so it was something that this is something that, we were unable to really talk about until very, very recently. And I do think it's good. I think it is good to the extent that you're able to be having these conversations before you get married, and hopefully have a reasonable understanding of what your expectations should be about marriage. Because one of the things that, getting back to the Christopher West episode, uh one of the things that sort of triggered this gentleman's question is they were going through this Christopher West course, and one of the comments was like, "Don't expect marriage to cure your masturbation problem." And boy, is that true. Now, no one ever told us that before we got married, but I don't know if there's anything maybe more true than that. But that is something I think it would be good for more people to understand before they get married, because I think a lot of people, myself included, thought, well, okay, you get to marriage, kind of letting you know the words of St. Paul. I mean, it's sort of supposed marriage is sort of supposed to be a salve to that kind of stuff. And my experience has been it uh, only amplifies the challenges of dealing with that, because you are now sexually active and then inactive for various reasons once you become pregnant, have kids, and postpartum and all that. And but I think a lot of people still go into marriage with the idea that this is not some this is if this happens, it's something that maybe happens for teenage boys or girls, but doesn't happen or shouldn't happen once the marriage happens. And the truth is that the it's just not the case, right? And so I think then the question then is, are we is it actually good advice? Is it actually practical advice to say you should not even get engaged, or let's say let's should not get married if it's been less than 6 months since your last slip up in one or both of these categories? Um, what do people think about that? I mean, I I might not be married yet if that was the standard. I don't know. I mean, that is the I think that is that I think that that comment I think reflects a lack of um reality on his part. I just and maybe and I think he sincerely believes that. I don't think he's just saying that because he thinks he has to. I think his situation for one reason or another is just very, very different than for most people. Now, for those that don't know, Christopher West has written a lot of things and some things that have been controversial in the past. One of the things that he has said, and he's always been up in front about this, is that he, as a young man, I think in those late teens and maybe early 20s, college age, he was by his own words, I think, a masturbation and porn addict. Now, I don't know what that means. Can different people might, have different definitions of what that mean. But in his mind, he was addicted to it. And then when he kind of had his conversion, if you will, he stopped all those things and apparently has never done it again, which I find remarkable. Not in a bad way. I find that quite remarkable, given the fact that I know, he's married, he's a good Catholic. They've used NFP and based on some of his stuff he's written have, gone significant periods of times without it. Um, I find it just quite remarkable that he's been able to do that. Not even once or twice. Now maybe he's not being completely transparent about that, but that's kind of what he has said. Um, now, it, let's just say there are other things that he has said in the past that at least call into question his own personal, let's say, his own kind of his own sexual attractions and maybe the level of sexual desire he has compared to other people. I just leave it at that. Um, but I mean, I'm assuming he's a reasonably healthy, reasonable, normal man. He has the same drives that everyone else does, and so. But I think he represents a path that most of us would have a very difficult time relating to. But I think his opinions on this matter are somewhat skewed by his own experience that I think is, let's say, maybe worthy of aspiration by people, but hardly very comparable to what I think the actual stats would say based on my experience in talking to people, the Twitter polls, etc. And so I think that's just pretty. I mean, maybe it's not bad advice in the truest theological technical sense. I think on a practical level, if I think you are really raising the barrier to entry for most people to get married. And even if you, let's say you grow up in a very, very super I don't want to say strict, but let's say super zealous Catholic home, and your parents managed to keep you um safe from all of the stuff that is out there, and you kind of, let's say you get to the wedding altar having maintained your purity in the fullest sense of the word. um you know Marriage is, you have no idea what you are getting into until you've been married. And I almost wonder if those people that have never had any quote unquote slip ups may just be in even worse shape when it comes to marriage because now they may feel like total failures. Holy cow. I made it all these years. Now I'm married. Now I'm falling into these things or one of these things. And I think that these kinds of ideas, these kinds of um, aspirational opinions that Christopher West and those kinds of folks have, I think are contributing to that, and I think are contributing to a situation where a lot of people live very quietly and painfully in secret with a lot of pain and guilt and anguish and all that kind of stuff that um, I think is just common enough and predictable enough that we ought to just step back and say, does it really have to be this way? Um, so that that's kind of all I wanted to really say about that. I just think it's hard as Catholics where we have these sort of absolute standards, these absolute moral rules. It, I think it is really hard, especially with people in authority or people in public figures like Christopher West. I think it's really hard for them in any kind of a public setting to kind of wade into the weeds and to say, let's just talk about reality. Let's set aside theory and doctrine for a moment and let's just talk about reality. I think they are very uncomfortable there, maybe rightly so, because they are afraid of causing scandal or leading people astray or whatever. And I get that, and I totally respect that. But I think as Catholics, I think we have hamstrung ourselves and made it virtually impossible for us to kind of talk about these things in a realistic way, maintaining our values and our moral expectations for people, but at the same time being able to kind of sit down and see each other for who we are and who most the kinds of struggles that most of us have. And I think that's the biggest thing that's been missing and is still missing in our church and our theology and pastoral care for people is I don't think there is a there is no real presence of people in authority, people with credentials, people with whatever that are in a position where they can speak kind of freely and practically and pastorally with people, except let's say in quiet conversations in the corner of the room that must not be repeated elsewhere. That I think is a real issue for the church, and I think it is contributing to a lot of people, good young men and women going into marriage completely unprepared for what lies, what awaits them, and une- unequipped with the tools that they need to confront those issues when they come up. So, um, yeah, thanks for those comments, Tyler. So he's a 33-year-old man who returned to the faith after a pretty hedonistic 20s. I would hope my partner would be able to show me the same grace I would extend to her to grow together and not be perfect going on. I'm curious, because one thing I have observed, it's not universal, but and I don't know that I would put Christopher West in this category because I think his quote unquote hedonism, if you want to call it that, maybe he was just being a normal, pretty average young man. But it has been my experience that those that have gone through that life, let's say they were away from the faith or were never part of the faith during let's say the teens and 20s, and let's say just kind of let it all hang out. We're doing anything and everything, and truly were in a out of control fashion, both relationally and morally. And then when they kind of come to their senses, come back, it's been my experience, and there's a number of, I would say, prominent Catholic voices that don't seem that way, don't seem very sympathetic to those going through those struggles, or even on a much lesser degree, just let's say just regular average struggles, not just complete quote unquote hedonism, but just slip ups that can happen and probably do happen for a lot of people. I don't see a lot of sympathy or pastoral sensitivity for people that's just kind of been their experience. They've been they've been, pretty good overall, but they've been imperfect, right? They're imperfect, and maybe at different times they were less perfect than others. Um, but I see a resistance to from people that have had that, let's say, checkered past, to giving any kind of I don't know, sensitivity, grace, whatever you want to call it, to that, because my feeling, and they seem to be, excuse me, they seem to be very much attracted to a very rigid, oftentimes traditional approach to things, absolutes. And I think in many ways, because they've been in that out of control phase of their life, and are afraid that any amount of laxity, if you will, or grace will just set them off or set other people off. And I get that. I think that is a understandable concern, but I think it might be a little bit exaggerated of a concern. Um, so I take note when I see some of the more prominent voices who are ultra rah rah about the quote unquote rules, whether it's ranging from anything from, you know porn and contraception down to masturbation, or dressing, modest dress and all that. I can't help but notice a pattern of people that have been, like I said, on the very, very extreme kind of out of control part of their life, tend to overcompensate. I think when they find their faith, or refine their faith. And I'm really kind of interested in the group of people that really never had those extremes in their life, just had kind of the, I would say, the normal ups and downs, challenges before and during marriage. And what do we do with that? And how concerned should we be that someone is, let's say, an A student, but not an A plus student when it comes to these things, or maybe you're a B minus student when it comes to these things? How concerned should we be about that? Um, and what should we do with those people? Can can most of us ever really be A plus students when it comes to these things? I think for most of us, probably not. And I think it's probably unrealistic to expect A plus work out of, you know A A students or B students. Um, so that's again, I don't really mean to like cast too broad of use too broad of a stroke here, but I can't help but notice that a lot of the prominent voices in this space tend to be people who have had a phase of their life that they're deeply, deeply um, embarrassed by, ashamed by, maybe all rightly so, and then I think just tend to overcompensate in the other direction, and are unwilling or unable to kind of, like I said, just step back, sit down, and just look at how people's lives actually are. And so I think that's something that the church could really benefit from, is having the capacity to kind of present the faith, and to help people and reach people on kind of the level that most of us probably find ourselves at. And I hope maybe that can change a little bit. Maybe some of the stuff that I bring to you guys here, and over in the other channel, can maybe help foster that a little bit, because I think for most of us, we're imperfect. We're not great, but we're not train wrecks, right? We're just kind of somewhere in the middle. There's always room for improvement, and marriage has seasons, and marriage is a process of growth and all that. And I just think maybe if we could just be a little more organic in terms of our approach to these things, when kind of in parallel with kind of that organic growth and seasoning that goes with most marriages. Maybe we could help people find more joy in marriage, more joy in their faith, and maybe not find themselves in quite as many kind of crises that I think a lot of people find themselves in because they don't know how to deal with A+ standards in their B+ or A- lives, right? So that's all I wanted to say for that. Um, yeah, if you guys have you come and watch this later, or whatever, and have any comments or thoughts about it, feel free to leave them in the comments, or if you'd like to send me a message, you can go over on Twitter. You can always DM me. I think my DMs are always open, so I'm always happy to talk to people there. I keep everything confidential that people share with me. Um, or if you want to send me an email, feel free to do that. Craig at unchartedcatholicman.com. And if you are if you want more than that, if you'd like to have a conversation or possibly get into one of our Discord communities, let me know. Just send me an email or a DM, and I'll be happy to see if that's a good fit for you. Otherwise, I appreciate you guys for watching. I always enjoy your comments and your good, bad, and otherwise. And hopefully, should be back next week with more content. So anyway, appreciate you all for watching, and until next time, everyone, have a good one.